Special welcome to anyone joining us for the first time today. We're really looking forward to today's session, which is entitled Flight, Return, and Emigration, The Wanderings of a Yiddish Writer During and After the Holocaust, which is the session will be about Yiddish poet Chaim Grade. And we're so happy to have Professor David Fishman, Professor of Jewish History at JTS, teaching us. Dr. Fishman, you're always a favorite in these Monday webinars, so thank you for teaching us today. If you would like to partner with us in this webinar series by sponsoring a session, please be in touch with Learning Lives at jtsa.edu. We have a couple of sponsorship levels, and you'll see information about that in the chat. And on that note, I will turn things over to Tani Schwartz-Herman.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Just to review how we'll do a Q&A today, Dr. Fishman will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, so we also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your question to Rabbi Julia Andelman. During the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Fishman. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Stacy Firestone. Stacy is filling in for Lynn Feynman today. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session and will be screen shared as well. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. David Fishman. Dr. Fishman is a professor of Jewish history at JTS, teaching courses in modern Jewish history. He also serves as director of Project Judaica, JTS's program in the former Soviet Union, which is based at Kiev Mohyla Academy University. Dr. Fishman is the author of numerous books and articles on the history and culture of East European Jewry. His most recent book, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures for the Nazis, was the recipient of the Jewish Book Council's 2017 National Jewish Book Award. So pleased to turn it over now to Dr. Fishman.
Thank you, Tani. Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon or good evening, whichever it may be. I'm actually on a journey myself right now in my wife's hometown of Modena, Italy. So for me, it's evening. But good afternoon to most of you. I feel like though I don't have a direct conversation, I've seen many of you before in other sessions. And this series seems to be really very special. And let me explain, since this is the week before Tisha B'Av, and the theme of this series is Jewish journeys and traveling, real or imagined. But I thought, especially this week, it's worth recalling that not all Jewish journeys were voluntary. Not all Jewish journeys were happy. Tisha B'Av is connected with exile and with dispersion and with suffering. And many Jewish journeys were those of expulsion or of flight or of deportation. So I don't have a happy trip to share with you today. You know, it's not a pilgrimage, but it is an important Jewish journey for us to remember, especially given the season we're in. And it's the journey of one Yiddish writer, Chaim Grade, from Vilna to Central Asia, to Vilna, and then to New York. So really someone who in 7 years spanned literally half the globe in very fateful years. And I'm going to turn on, you're most of the time going to see the different slides I want to show you. I'll come back full screen at the question periods, and I will break after 20 minutes of talking or so. I will stop for the Q&A through the chat. So there will be 3 such sessions of Q&A after 20 minutes of each period. Okay, let me get to the crucial moment. And hold on. I must make it into a slideshow, which is the hard part. Tani, can you make it a tied slideshow? I don't know if you can because I'm blocked here.
I can't do anything on your screen, but
Okay.
you can't hit the slideshow button there at the top in the middle.
Well, it's blocked. It's blocked, you know, by the other Zoom functions. Maybe it will go away in a little bit. Hold on, let me just see. Bear with me, everybody. No, I'm just going to leave it as this for the moment because there may be another way to do it, but I'm not sure what that. There we are. I found it. This is the writer, Chaim Grade, born 1910, died 1982. He is one of the great Yiddish writers of the 20th century. In fact, his most famous or most prominent works are a 2-volume novel called The Yeshiva and a very readable novel called The Aguna. And many people thought that he should have won the Nobel Prize for literature sometime in the 1970s instead of Isaac Bashevis Singer. Everybody understood that only one Yiddish writer would ever win the Nobel Prize. So there were actions when Singer won. I won't hide from you that Grade is of interest to me in many ways, including a personal way because I knew him during the last 3-4 years of his life. It was a short period, but a very intense one. You can actually see he was at my wedding. That's me on the there in the left-hand corner many years ago, more than 40 years ago. And on the right, he accompanies me in my life. I've read many of his works many times and read just one of his novels again now to prepare for this talk. And if you're curious, it was just released this YouTube video of me having a conversation with someone about Chaim Grade. It's in Russian, but with English subtitles. Okay. Chaim Grade was born in the community of Vilna in 1910. It's a part of the world in Eastern Europe where borders changed a lot. But between the 2 world wars, Vilna belonged to Poland, as you can see in the northeastern corner of Poland. Here is Warsaw, here is Vilna. But Jews, even though it belonged to Poland, Jews called it Lithuania, and called Vilna Jerusalem de Lita, the Jerusalem of Lithuania. It's a community with a very particular profile. The famous rabbi, the Vilna Gaon. The Talmud was printed many times in Vilna. And in his era, the 20th century, it becomes like the Jerusalem of modern secular Yiddish culture. Many Yiddish newspapers, actually 5 Yiddish newspapers at its peak, published in this city, which was not the biggest Jewish community in Poland. A Yiddish research institute, YIVO, which today is in New York, and really Jewish life functioned more than anywhere else in Yiddish, not in Polish, not in Russian. So that there was even such a thing as a Yiddish marionette, theater for kids. Now Grade grew up in a kind of, sometimes called a mixed marriage. His father was a semi-enlightened Jew, a maskil, someone who read Moses Mendelssohn's commentary on the Bible, who read modern Hebrew poetry, and while he was he was traditional, was certainly not orthodox by the standards of Vilna at the turn of the 20th century. He was, for a living, a teacher of Hebrew. But the father became ill and for many years was lying in bed home and died when Grade was a teenager. He's not a very active presence in this writer's life. It's his mother who is the central presence in his life. And the author, Chaim Grade, grew up in abject poverty. His mother sold apples on the street in baskets, literally in front of their house. They lived in the back room of a blacksmith's smithy. In other words, not living conditions anybody really should have. A single room for a family of 3 or then just of 2, filth, crowdedness, tools everywhere. But his mother was very pious, prayed, said, read the Tsenorem, the women's Bible, said Tchinis, but she's also very wise, very sensitive. Her neighbors all respect her and revere her. This is on one of the poorest streets in the old Jewish quarter of Vilna. And I think that experience is very important for Grade, that the distinction between the external and the internal, that you can be on the outside, living very in poverty, being part of the lower class, so to speak, and yet internally he saw this wisdom and nobility and sensitivity, all of that reflected in his mother. And his mother remains the probably most important figure in his life. The second great influence on him is his teacher. Grade went to yeshivas through his throughout all his teens and into his early 20s. So he had a very extensive rabbinic education, and he studied and lived with a very famous rabbi, this one, Rebbe Avram Yeshaya Karelitz, better known by the books he wrote that are known as Chazon Ish. So he had a very close and intimate relationship with the Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish left for the land of Israel, for Eretz Yisrael in 1933, when Grade was 23. And it's around that time that Grade had a very sharp break in his life and stopped being religious. He had always been more interested in people than in the Talmud. And Chazon Ish always complained that he was looking at the trees and at nature, and he was looking at all kinds of things, just not at the page of the book. And once his teacher left, he left that world rather abruptly, and quite totally. And he became a secular Yiddish poet, a member of this literary group known as Young Vilna. And that is Chaim Grade here in the left-hand corner. The other most famous figure in that group is the Yiddish poet Avram Sutzkever, who many consider the greatest Yiddish poet of the 20th century. And Grade wrote, many call him, by the way, the Bialik of Yiddish literature. In other words, someone who was raised in the yeshiva, left it, but its imprint remains in all his writing afterwards. And also, Grade did have a kind of prophetic voice, like Bialik. I mentioned just one poem, which is called The Cry of Generations, which he published in 1937, which is about the different generations of his family. His great-grandfather, who was martyred, who died on Kiddush Hashem, killed in a pogrom, his great-grandfather. His grandfather, who fought for Napoleon against the Russians, in other words, for liberty, equality, fraternity, against the Tsar. And his father, who fought for enlightenment and against religious fanaticism, his father, the Maskil. And Grade writes in the poem that all these generations, I can feel them in my blood, their tears, their cries, their yearning, it's all in me and pushing me. So that kind of a depth of awareness of all the generations that preceded me are in me, and the many different things that those different generations represent, very typical of Grade, that kind of combination. His first book, Yes, in 1936. And I should say at about this time, he married someone just like himself, she was the daughter of a rabbi who had rebelled against her father and became a nurse. And that was actually a very happy marriage, though sadly short-lived. Then the war broke out in 1939. Now, in 1939, the Nazis did not enter Vilna. In 1939, if you know your history, and if not, I'm here to tell it to you, the Soviets entered Vilna. Poland was divided in 1939. Western Poland came under Nazi occupation, Warsaw. Eastern Poland came, like Vilna, came under Soviet occupation for basically Soviet domination for almost 2 years, without getting into nuances and complexities. So the Nazis only came to Vilna in June 1941, when they attacked the Soviet Union, a former ally or quiet ally. The Germans attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941, and literally, first of all, it was a very Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. As you can see, this was the plan, and this was the implementation. What I want to show you, first of all, is within 6 months, the Germans from June 1941 till December 1941 were nearly near Moscow, really on the border of Moscow. They reached Vilna, or Vilnius as it was called by the Lithuanians, 2 days after the war broke out. In other words, the war broke out on June 22nd, actually, and by June 24, they had conquered Vilna. Now, Grade and his young wife decided that they were going to run. They were going to flee. Grade and the whole group of young Vilna, these writers he belonged to, were identified as on the political left. And Grade feared, they didn't know a lot in June 1941 about what the Nazis were doing in Warsaw at that point, but he definitely thought that as a writer, as an intellectual, as a person known on the left, and as a Jew, as a Jewish writer, intellectual, he was in danger, and therefore he should flee. And he would flee with his wife. He had to bid farewell to his mother. His mother was too old and too ill because this meant running by foot. Her last words to him as he bid farewell to her was, keep Judaism, keep the Shabbos. Right? And this story that we know, but I'm telling you is all of it recorded in Chaim Grade's very first book of prose, memoir, really, called My Mother's Sabbath Days. So much of what I'm telling you is based on this novel, My Mother's Sabbath Days. And again, that's her final words, keep Judaism, keep the Shabbos. He ran by foot out of town with his wife. With only 2 things, a backpack, a knapsack on his back, with some clothes and a few little things, a little bit of food, some money, and a pocket Bible, Hebrew Bible, a Tanakh in his pocket. That Tanakh would eventually actually save his life. Now, we know a lot, I think all of us know a lot about what it means to be in a ghetto or in a camp. We've heard a lot. We've heard a lot less about what it means to be a refugee and to flee the Nazis. The first thing it meant was that the 2 of them fled on foot, for literally scores of miles. Soviet vehicles were leaving. Soviets are evacuating their military, their government officials, but they're not taking any civilians with them on the vehicles. So everybody's running on foot. and the roads start to get bombed by German planes. And because the roads are being bombed by German planes, people start running where there are forests, to run away where they can't be seen from the sky. But it's dark and it's hard to know where you're going, and if you're going in the right direction or the wrong direction. After about 15, 20 miles outside of Vilna, his wife hurt her foot and couldn't run anymore. And they were near a peasant hut. They settled down, and that's where they decided in that hut that she would eventually go back to Vilna and he would continue on the way running away. And that's what they did. And as you realize, that was a very fateful decision. In other words, she returned to Vilna. She was in the Vilna ghetto, and she perished. He kept running on foot and eventually on train. When he got to the city of Minsk and then to another city, Borisov, there was a train station. And this gives you an image of what it means. These trains are not only jam-packed, they are literally people sitting on the roofs. His actually train wasn't even a train. It was just it was a freight train, an open platform. There's not even seats or carts, and you just lie there, dozens of people lying, bundles and bodies wrapped up, no food, or little drink. When it's hot, it's hot. When it's raining, you're drenched. And I think I will, so you get this, he does by, parts of the way running, parts of the way on trains. He'll get to different destinations. Look at this, right? From Vilnius to Minsk, from Minsk to Voronezh to Penza. This is inner Russia. You can see this is south of Moscow. And eventually into the far Russia. This is all to get away far from the front. The Germans are coming from this way. And then the Soviets start pushing people on. Eventually he'll go through Central Asia and end up in Dushanbe, which is the capital of Tajikistan. Most Jewish refugees ended up in Uzbekistan, in cities like Tashkent and Samarkand. And I just want to finish this section by telling you one story. The Soviets are obsessed that there are spies among these people fleeing, especially among the people they don't know that are not old Soviet citizens, but people from the newly acquired territories like Grade. They're obsessed that the Germans were throwing down people in parachutists who would then disguise themselves as Soviet citizens and actually act as spies. So the Soviets suspect everybody. And Chaim Grade has got a strange name, Grade, which certainly doesn't sound Slavic. He happened to have light hair, which they thought made him look like a German. And so a rumor develops at one checkpoint, this guy is a spy. And, this is war. There's not lots of time for decisions to make. Things are decided on a split second. And soldiers take him, empty his pockets, his body, search. They find this book, the Tanakh. And they say, what is it? He says, it's a Bible. Oh, they say, oh, you're a German pastor. You look blonde and you have a strange name. You're a German pastor, right? You're a spy. He says, no, I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew. I'm fleeing the Nazis. They say, we're taking you to headquarters. You're arrested. They put him in handcuffs. They take him to headquarters where he might get shot. Believe me, there's no, this is summary justice. There's no trial. And they take him to a higher officer, and the officer says, what's your story? He says, I'm a Jew. This is a Bible. And the officer looks at the book and smiles and doesn't say anything. He just turns to the soldiers and says, let him go, let him go. In other words, this was a Jewish officer in the Red Army, in the Soviet Army. He recognized what this book was. He hadn't seen one in a long time. and he said, let him go. And it was thanks to that Bible that Grade wasn't, sent to his death by the Soviets. Okay, as I promised, my first 20 minutes are up. I think I'll stop here. I've been giving you this is mainly a narrative talk, and there may be questions, there may not be, in which case I'll take the story further.
I'm just starting to get questions in. The first question was about the poverty that you talked about, and if there was any financial obstacle to poor children getting a yeshiva education in this context, or that was the only option. Sort of tell us how kids and poor kids got educated.
First of all, I just do want to say, not everybody in Vilna was as poor as Chaim Grade. He lived in the poorest neighborhood, and there were different social classes of Jews in that community. But it's actually the other way around. In other words, yeshivas were supported by donors, and the reason that was not yeshivas, as opposed to were not tuition charging institutions. What I'm telling you actually is it made it financially easier for his mother to get by. The fact that her son was away and eating meals somewhere else at the yeshiva. It was when he was home that life was even harder financially. To have a Shabbat meal with meat or fish, that was hard for her on her budget of selling apples.
Interesting. So we have a few questions about his wife, the wife he had to leave behind that you talked about. And I don't know if you haven't really gotten into his work yet, so maybe this question is premature in terms of how his feelings about having to leave her behind might have come into his work later on. If you want to defer that question.
Never thought of it that way, but obviously the sense of guilt and of obligation, both towards his wife and his mother, and more broadly towards his community. He was a lucky one. He survived. So that's a very strong feature. And what does he owe the dead? What does he owe his wife? What does he owe his mother? What does he owe his whole community? That by all these circumstances, he survived and they did not. So I guess that's a essential theme in all his works.
Okay, thanks. And maybe just one more question for now. Someone was curious if you have any scholarly insight on the decision of the Nobel Committee in terms of Singer over Grade.
Well, Singer was much better known in English translation, translated much earlier than Grade. Singer was part of the American literary scene. And so I don't think it was a fair competition to begin with, back then especially. Both are great, and it's unfortunate that both couldn't win. I don't know what was going on in the Nobel Committee's mind, but one of the things going on in their mind was to pay tribute to the Yiddish language. But I think they went for the better known writer in the Western world. Okay, now I'm going to take you back. Things may accumulate as we go on. So I've told you what it means to be on the run. Eventually, he'll get into Central Asia to today is called Dushanbe in Tajikistan. And again, the life of a refugee is not as bad as the life in the ghetto, but especially if you're a foreign refugee, not an old Soviet citizen, you don't have, where to live, really. You don't have a job. Your clothes are torn. There are some soup kitchens. Those who are lucky to have jobs, Grade didn't have a job, but some of his friends had work. As you steal from work because the pay is terrible. So the only way you can make ends meet is to steal something at work that you can sell. Of course, if you're caught, you're in prison for a long time. So there's fear. There's a lot of uncertainty. Grade himself, just to give you a sense, lived in a room that he didn't rent a room. He rented space in a room with a woman and her son. The woman was a truck driver by day and a prostitute by night. He hated going home at night, but he had to sleep somewhere. And the whole time, of course, and life, as he describes it there, is grotesque. Actually, there are a lot of war, wounded and invalids from the war. That is, young men are missing. They're all sent to the front to fight in the war. But those who are wounded in the war are sent back to Central Asia, people without legs, people without arms, people with very severe injuries. So the only types of men there are around are the elderly, the wounded, and refugees like him. Because he was a foreigner, they didn't even trust him to send him to the Red Army. Okay, let me get back. So all this time, Grade was not in the Vilna ghetto. His mother and his wife were. And on the left is the gate to the ghetto. The Jews of Vilna numbered 70,000 on the eve of the German invasion. The Vilna ghetto existed 2 years. It was dissolved, that is liquidated, in September of 1943. Most of Vilna's Jews were sent to this mass murder site called Ponar, or Ponari, or Panerai, depending on your language, which was a shooting site. In other words, this is the Holocaust by bullets. People were mowed down in rows, literally just a few miles from their homes. And Ponar is the place where both his mother and his wife perished. His mother early, his wife later. So as far as inhabitants of the Vilna ghetto, probably no more than 1,000 survived out of, the 70,000 Jews when the Germans came in. People who lived in the ghetto, less than 1,000 were able to escape one way or another. Grade returns as the war winds down. He did stop off in Moscow. And I will mention one last experience of his in Dushanbe, which is the only Jews besides the refugees that were there were Bukharan Jews, that is Central Asian Jews. The problem was, even though both groups recognized they're Jews, they could not communicate. A lot of Bukharan Jews did not even know Russian. So you couldn't talk to them in Russian, you couldn't talk to them in Yiddish. He tried, Grade, speaking to them in Hebrew, but rabbis would know Hebrew, but most Bukharan Jews did not speak Hebrew. And there was no way for them to really communicate, even though they felt this affinity. And finally, in a kind of act of exasperation, Grade turned to one of them and says, "Me, Vilna, Vilna." And then their eyes light up, because one of the Bukharan Jews had a Chumash that was printed in Vilna. And he took out the Chumash and showed it to him. And then they realized they're connected. They'd heard, these Bukharan Jews had heard of Vilna because it's such a great center of Jewish printing. And immediately they gave him a pomegranate, which was a really nice thing to get for a refugee, and said to him, Shehechianu, Shehechianu. In other words, when the holiday comes up, you can make the blessing Shehechianu on this new fruit. So the bond was there, and Vilna was Bukharan Jews during World War II. Now I'm going to come to the stage of return. Vilna was liberated by the Red Army, that is, the Soviets conquered Vilna. Well, the war was still going on for much longer, right? In July of 1944, that's the forward saying, Vilna taken. And Grade would return almost a year later, it was hard to move around the Soviet Union, and there were all kinds of permits and paperwork, and they just weren't letting people go wherever they wanted. When he came, of course, he found the city in ruins. You're looking actually at streets from his neighborhood, from the old Jewish quarter. In other words, totally razed by bombs and by combat. And what he writes in this section of his memoir, My Mother's Sabbath Days, is, well, very much a lament. He is a Jeremiah mourning the destruction of his Jerusalem. And he talks about everything being desolate, right? The Yivo building also in ruins. Right? Since my return to Vilna, I've roamed through the 7 little alleys that once made up the ghetto. Someone inside cries aloud, so be it. I want to become a ruin. This inner cry comes from Vidibik, the spirit of ruins. Since my return has taken up residence within me, this Dibik has taken up residence with me. Now he speaks, the Dibik within. Woe unto me that I have returned here. There in Central Asia, there are snow-capped mountains. Here, raised houses. I walk across paving stones, and it feels as if I am walking across a pavement of heads. Every stone has a different face, a different mask. How much better to have the sands of Karakum blowing in my face than to hold in my hands the ashes of the ghetto. All is empty, all is still dead. Here the day is as dead and as desolate as the night. Here the week is made up of 7 Sabbaths, but the Sabbath here is the Sabbath of retribution, a Sabbath eternally cursed. In the Tochacha, in the curses, section of curses in the Torah, it talks about all your days being Sabbath, meaning nothing happening, dead, inactivity. And that's what he's alluding to when he says a 7-week, 7 day, 7 Sabbaths all week, as in the Tochacha, as in the retribution. And Grade meets different survivors of the ghetto when he returns. I want to describe them to you. One is this shoemaker called Iskin. He survived because he disguised himself as a Gentile and lived out in a village among peasants as a Belarusian peasant. And he's still, most of the time, this guy, Iskin, poses as if he's a Belarusian peasant. In other words, he's hiding his Jewishness. The war is over, but for most of the time and most people, he's hiding his Jewishness. But at night, he goes back to his old shoe store, I guess you could call it, his own shop. And there, that's in the old Jewish neighborhood. And there he works on shoes and thinks about his wife and son who were murdered, who did not escape like him from the ghetto. So he communes with his family sometimes, but most of the time he's actually trying to run away from his Jewishness and that whole fate. The other survivor he meets is this pediatrician named Anna Iskin. She also, her husband and her son, one of her 2 sons perished, one son survived. And she says about her family, my husband's death is a great loss for me, but my son's death is a great loss for the world. He would have really done something in this world. She's still helping out with children because there are surviving children who have returned to Vilna after the war, and she treats them. There was a Jewish orphanage in Vilna, now called Vilnius, after the war. And this is a real historical, most of what Grade writes is real and really historical. And she talks about the children in the novel, right? In the orphanage, there are children who hid in the malinas, That's hiding places, Yiddish term for hiding places, where they knew they must never cry. To this day, these children are afraid to let a sound pass their lips. They sit pale and silent. No matter how many times we tell them, now they're allowed to play, to laugh, even to cry. Now, Anna Itkin, the pediatrician, she has a different attitude towards, how to adjust, how to confront what has happened. And her approach, which I think actually is the seed of Grade's own approach, is that the living must sort of commune with the dead, that it's an obligation of the living to commune with the dead. And here she says, we must live with our memories of those who have perished, not with the memory of their terrible deaths, but of their joys and sorrows in life. A young man must remember an old man, and an old man a young man. Whichever of them has remained alive must recite Kaddish for the other with his heart, not with his lips. A wife must not be jealous if a husband sees before his eyes the murdered brides of other young men. Let her know that she must pay a price for having stayed alive. She must be prepared for her husband's giving a part of his love to those who are no more, whom no one longs for or remembers, those poor mute doves. If we could learn to live such a double life, to live with our memories, then our wounds would slowly heal. And that's Anna Itkin's approach, which is everyone should take the souls of a couple of perished people into their hearts and live their lives, live their own life, but that other perished person is always with them. Her son, this is a third, this is, sort of what we're getting here is a kind of a rainbow of different types of survivors. They're right there. It's 1945. They're living on the ruins, and how they react to the trauma they've gone through. Of course, Grade is a returnee. He didn't go through it. And the 64,000-pound elephant in the room is they knew his wife and his mother in the ghetto. Initially, he's afraid to even ask them about his wife and mother, but eventually things start to come out about how his wife worked in the ghetto hospital, how she saved children's lives, how she saved, at least early on, the mother's life. He starts to learn things that happened. And a woman who was a neighbor of theirs, who also survived the ghetto, tells him, of course I knew Vela, that's his mother, the fruit peddler. Why, for years we bought our merchandise from the same wholesalers. There were several aktionen in the small ghetto. One of the first was on Yom Kippur. But exactly when your mother went, I don't know. And then Grade responds, she went on Yom Kippur, I say to myself. All her life she had lived with Sabbath and with Yom Kippur. She went upon her as she would go to the synagogue. While still in Asia, I had already decided that my mother's yortzeit must fall on Yom Kippur. I want to mention one other survivor. So he's confronting, and this is a kind of attraction, repulsion. He wants to go visit the places where his wife and his mother lived in the ghetto, but he doesn't. He goes, he finds them empty. He had hoped to find something, maybe a piece of clothing. Someone had told him that his wife had kept his mother's Sabbath shawl. He wanted to find something. He finds absolutely nothing. And he sort of regrets that he even tried to get that close and to visit their homes. The last thing I want to mention before I take the next break is, he has a section on Yom Kippur, which is a couple weeks after he's arrived. He doesn't pray. He can't pray. He won't pray. He broke with religion before the war, and certainly after the war. His approach is, if there is a God, he is the greatest mass murderer of all. But what does he do on Yom Kippur? He ruminates while walking amidst the ruins of different synagogues in Vilna. I'm showing you an image of the great synagogue and the synagogue courtyard, the Shulhof in Vilna, as it looked before the war. This is the great synagogue. This is the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. That great rabbi, the Vilna Gaon, had his own private synagogue in his home. He didn't go to the great synagogue. And there are many smaller houses of prayer here and behind it, because there's an alleyway here, and there are more synagogues. And he goes to every single one. But of course, it means marching on top of mountains of rubble. The synagogue courtyard, you may have seen that in the previous slide, you enter through these gates. The Shulhof, you enter through gates and then you're inside. And this is the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon. Hagra is Gaon Rabbeinu Eliyahu. But now this is what he finds: the synagogue of the Vilna Gaon, the steps ruined. He says it's like Jacob's ladder going up to the heavens had collapsed. And this is the great synagogue, right? What's left of it. And this is his Yom Kippur, of walking amidst synagogue. One of his synagogues was of the Chevra Kadisha, of the Burial Society, and was known as the Gravedigger Synagogue, which he says, but now the synagogue of the gravediggers has itself become a grave. And he sort of concludes that section of his tour of synagogues on Yom Kippur in lieu of prayer, instead of prayer. As once on Tisha B'Av, during my youth, I had sat shoeless on the beam of the Gravediggers Chapel, and I read the Book of Lamentations for the congregants. Now the beam is gone, and gone too is the pious young boy who had once lamented, "The Lord is righteous, for I have rebelled against his word." That's taken out of Eicha of Lamentations. That boy is gone, that synagogue is gone. High on the eastern wall, where the holy ark had stood, one solitary word still hangs: Anochi, I. Above the ruins, there burns the first word of the 10 Commandments: Anochi, I am the Lord your God. Then again, could it be taken from the verse in Isaiah, I am he that comforts you? Or does it rather mean, I am the guilty one? Okay, so the return, the long journey home is a very painful one for him. And he knows from the beginning, he can't stay here. He won't stay here. And that will be the third and last section of this, is his journey and then his settling in America. But I think I'll stop here for the second round of questions.
Thank you. It's very powerful material, needless to say. So, well, just on the note that you just ended on, one person was asking, why did he go back to begin with? You talked about looking for kind of traces of his family, but most just kept going and went further away.
He doesn't address that explicitly in this novel. I think it's almost, for many people, it's a natural impulse. Some people went back because maybe they'll find a friend. Maybe they'll find somebody alive. Maybe they'll find something they needed as an interim stage before moving on to a new life. You want to, you're right, many people did not even once want to see it again. He had to pass through anyway because he's all the way in Central Asia. He wants to get back. Even if he wants to leave the Soviet Union, he's going to move west. So he's moving in the direction he wants to move anyway. But I think there's always the hope, maybe some friends, some acquaintance, maybe I'll find out at least what happened to my wife and my mother. Nobody tells him directly exactly when they were taken and how they were taken. The survivors, as he describes them, are very sensitive on that. And so they tiptoe around that. But he needed that. And all I can say is I think it was a real psychological need on his part to confront what he had not experienced himself, to see it.
I just following up on what you just said, that the survivors were hesitant to speak directly about when people were taken. That was because of their own trauma?
I think they were mindful that not everybody can take this. They had seen a lot, and they had seen different people react different ways. And they also themselves, had sort of black zones that they wouldn't enter. For instance, this pediatrician, Anna Iskin, she walked to work every day. The fastest route, the quickest route, the straight road would have taken her through streets that were the former ghetto, where she had been an inmate herself. She couldn't walk on those streets. She had to take a long circuitous route around to get to work, because that was just too painful and too creepy to walk through the streets of the ghetto. So all of them carried with them these kind of things. I can't talk about this, or I can't, do this. And so they knew that for someone like him, you had to be very gentle about what to mention. Oh yes, she was taken in this and this action and this date. That would just, so that's the way they reacted.
Mm. So you just mentioned Itkin, if I'm getting the name right, and a few people were curious to know, what more we know about her, if anything, or the rest of her life after this.
I don't know anything more. In fact, I'm not. Well, usually Grade gives false names. In other words, he usually gives a different name, because this is art, and I can't vouch for every single detail being historically or ethnographically accurate. And anyway, he wants to protect people by not giving their real names, different ways of protecting people. He once wrote a story about a rabbi. This is an aside, but I just say, set in pre-war Vilna. And that rabbi's son threatened to sue Chaim Grade, saying, you didn't give a positive portrayal of my father, and I know that's my father, right? So in part for reasons like that, he would change people's names to give himself the liberty of portraying as he wanted to. So I don't know what happened to literally to Anna Itkin herself, or actually I don't know her real name. I will say this, and it sort of leads me into the next section. She and Grade were both natives of Vilna. That's important because the law allowed former Polish citizens to leave the Soviet Union for Poland. Do you get that? In other words, Grade was born and was a citizen of Poland until the war broke out in 1939. Similarly, Anna Itkin. Soviet Jews could not leave the Soviet Union, but Polish Jews could leave the Soviet Union. And so that's the first step of Grade's emigration. He was able to leave for Poland, which was a separate country. And if I had to guess what Anna Itkin did, like the vast majority of Vilna-born Jews, she left for Poland, and from there for somewhere else.
There was a question about the images that you were sharing with us, and especially the pre-war images, what the provenance of them is, or if there's sort of another story there.
I put on a lot of effort into getting images. First of all, I find that for students, it's really helpful and important. So some of these images are just straight off the internet. You have to do a lot of digging, but some of them I have from special collections. I mean, that I've, it depends on which one, but, you know, unlike the destruction of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, we have images of Yerushalayim Delita, both before its destruction, during, and after its destruction, and that can help make this more vivid. There's no special story here, just a lot of legwork.
Maybe just, I was just curious, based on what you were saying previously, that, you know, kind of the autobiographical, but not explicitly so, nature of the work. Was that something that he discussed? You know, sort of how much of what he was writing about is really in a work that's casting itself as fiction. How much of it is autobiography, or did he not want to go there?
I never discussed that with him, and I don't know if he was asked about it directly. It's so obvious because yes, it weaves in and out, and it's so clear that much of this is very autobiographical in this book that I've been describing, and in some other books, because he appears as a character named Chaim Grade in his masterwork in the yeshiva. And there's a rabbi there who's clearly the Chazon Ish. He's just called the Machazeh Avraham, but that's the same as Chazon Ish. In other words, so, you know, but I think because it's a novel, he doesn't feel the urge or the need to chronicle. He feels the liberty of picking those details that matter to him and skipping the rest. He doesn't give dates. I don't think there's a single novel where he gives dates. It's autobiographical, but that's already being a chronicler. He doesn't want to be a chronicler. So he is an artist. There's no doubt about it. And he can jump a year and years without even telling you I'm jumping a year, right? So he has the liberties of an artist, even if the material is autobiographical. And the material is not always autobiographical. But I have to say, as a historian, I'm often reading and trying to figure out who's who. In other words, in different characters. That seems to me like so-and-so, that seems to me like so-and-so. But that's because I'm a historian. He doesn't want you really to read it like a historian. He wants you to read it as literature. Okay, I'm going to go to the concluding section. If there's more, you know, we can go to okay. As I mentioned, Grade was fortunate. He was a former citizen of Poland, so he was allowed to leave Soviet Lithuania for Lodz, Poland. And here you're seeing him in Poland in 1946 with Avram Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginski. These are both writers from the same literary group, Jung Vilna. They both survived in the ghetto. This is Yitzchak Zuckerman, a leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So Grade was in Poland, but Poland after the war was not a very auspicious place to be for Jews. There was a famous pogrom in Poland, in Kielce, in July 1946, and there were lots of anti-Jewish violence in post-war Poland, and these writers, including Grade, were fortunate that they were able to get temporary visas to go to France, to Paris, and so. Of course, leaving from Vilna, this is like a change of the world, right? I mean, Paris was not, bombed and demolished as was Vilna or as was Warsaw. And the art is there and the architecture is there. But for them, it's just a temporary way station. And they'll actually end up, the three writers, going in three different directions. Sutzkever will settle in Israel, Grade will settle in the United States, and Kaczerginski will settle in Argentina. So these three writers, close friends from the same group before the war, end up after the war going in three different directions. Grade came to the United States. He was able to come to the United States because he had half brothers here. In other words, his father, the one who had died of illness, had had a previous marriage. He had children from a previous marriage. So Grade had half brothers in the United States, and that made it possible for him to immigrate to America. And that was I was showing you basically the building where he lived for 35 years, from 1948 to 1982. What did he do? After all, he came to America at the age of 38. He's an adult. He learned English, but he always had a very thick accent. He had not done anything in his adult life as a working other than write. So he wrote. He actually shifted mainly. He continued to write poetry, but he started to write novels, started to write prose, which were published in serialization weekly in Yiddish newspapers. So he got some pay from Yiddish newspapers for his installments of his novels. He was a great lecturer, and in the 40s and 50s and even in the 60s, there was still quite a bit of an audience of people who would go to listen to his Yiddish language lectures. He never spoke publicly in any other languages. He could speak English, everyday life he did, but he never spoke publicly in English. And when he visited Israel, something I'll come back to, he knew Hebrew very well, he spoke Hebrew very well, but he would never speak publicly in Hebrew. He wanted to speak in his native tongue and in the language he knew best. He's a writer, he's a master of language, and so he only spoke publicly in Yiddish. So he was a lecturer, a Yiddish lecturer, and then he had a couple of patrons. He had a couple of people who literally supported him and sponsored him, usually discreetly, usually by buying, supporting the publication of a book or something like that. He, on the one hand, he very much appreciated what America was. On the other hand, he really felt out of place in America, and something of a stranger. And I think he really developed a kind of and he decided, let me just go, that the mission of his literary career was to recreate pre-war Vilna. And what that meant was to write novels set in pre-war Vilna. Novels set in the 1920s and 1930s, either in Vilna or in Shtetlach nearby, and yeshivas. And this was his mission. It's ethnographically very rich. In other words, how people dress, the street, names of streets, different institutions, food. He really was trying to accomplish the impossible, which was kind of Tchiat HaMeitim, a kind of revival of the dead, that he can make that world come alive as if it had not been destroyed. And all the novels are set in the 20s and 30s. None of them, other than this first one, the memoir, goes into the Holocaust period. In other words, none of them go beyond. This is also very different than Isaac Bashevis. He never wrote anything that takes place in America. There isn't a single story or even chapter or scene that takes place in the United States. In other words, this is a writer living in the Bronx, and he's never gone back to his native city. He can't. It's part of the Soviet Union. He'd probably get arrested if he went there as a former Soviet citizen. He can't go back to his hometown. All he's got is memories, old maps, old pictures, friends, people also like that, and from his town, and with the use of those tools, he is basically mentally living in Vilna, for 35 years. Like Anna Itkin said, that every one of those who are alive should carry at least one of the dead with them in their minds forever. And again, it's all set before the war. Somewhere in the back of the mind, we readers know, these characters in this novel, they're all going to get killed. But it's never said. The narrator speaks as if it's in August of 1939. And and that is his great achievement. His other great achievement is, again, to open up the world of rabbis. He's probably the first Jewish writer, modern Jewish writer in any language, to really delve into the world of rabbis. Rabbis rabbis as human beings. What I mean by that is, with personal tragedies, with personal difficulties, with ambitions, with disappointments, and with competition. And again, you have to remember, he's writing these novels in the 1950s, 60s, in other words, way before Shtisel or anything like that, where the world of the ultra-Orthodox is now recognized as that it can be an object of, artistic inspiration. He's the first pioneer and he knew that world from the inside. He continued to be a totally secular man in America, of course. When he went to my wedding, I think I showed you the picture of my wedding, he said, "This is my second wedding in the 35 years I've been to America." And I know that he never went to synagogue, not on Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur, sort of like in his novel, on Yom Kippur, he would go, he was up in the Adirondacks. He had a summer home in the Adirondacks. He'd walk around in the forest and recite some prayers to himself. That was his Yom Kippur. But he really did not want to be part of some kind of formal, institutionalized religion. For him, his life was divided into two parts. The true world, which was the world before the war, a world where there was beauty, where there was integrity, where there was idealism. And then the world as he saw it after World War II, the world that he saw in America, which he thought was superficial, hypocritical, not the real thing. And he could not really identify with American Jewish life, which was all for him at best a kind of pale reflection of the real Jewish life, which was Vilna before the war. His one great regret in life is that he didn't settle in Israel, because he would have had a lot more friends and he would have been a lot happier. He had a lot of friends in Israel. His works were translated into Hebrew before they were translated into English, and their authorized translation, he reviewed them. And that may be, something that really gnawed him, that he should have made that decision maybe in 1948, he should have not come to the United States, but gone to, like Sutzkever, to Israel. But the way he rationalized it was by saying, if I had gone to Israel, I would have been so caught up with the present, so excited by the growth of this young Jewish state, by the emergence of this society and the amazing landscape. He said, I would have been writing poetry day and night. I would never have turned to prose, and I would never have written my monument to Vilna. I would have been a poet of the present and not a storyteller, a prose writer of the past. And he said, Vilna deserved to have, a monument put to it like I did. So it was, in the final analysis, not good for me, but good for the Jewish people that I stayed in America. Though basically rather lonely life that he had in America. Let me go back to sort of wrap things up. I may have one or two more things to say about his novels, but I want to mainly give the journey, right? The journey ends in 1982 with, and he's buried at a cemetery in Lodi, New Jersey. And on his tomb, you can see that there's a stone lower down, and that's a poem of his on his tombstone. And I've translated a couple of the stanzas, a little longer than that, but and I'll read it and give you a little running commentary. The gates of the Schulhof is the great synagogue courtyard, won't swing open for my casket. Let me just explain. Prominent rabbis, when there was a funeral, the procession would pass by the Schulhof, the courtyard of the great synagogue, and the gates would be opened. And then the procession would move on to the cemetery. So that's what he's alluding to when he says, the gates of the Schulhof won't swing open for my casket. There will be no eulogy on the steps of the old clois of the old synagogue. But in the world of departed souls, there will be great sorrow that the last Vilna Yorkside candle has been blown out. Who without me will revive you from the dead, my dear burnt city, and fill your empty dovecote with doves again, and allow acquaintances to meet on your streets, and make the windows shine with unbroken panes. That's an allusion to, not just talk about broken panes of pogroms, but talk about the shining through unbroken panes of the Sabbath, of Sabbath candles, things like that. As I grow older and more embittered from all my loves, my tears become more passionate and my heart grows younger. For you, now purified in an otherworldly gathering, and I, the last singer of your earthly memory. And although there's almost no one left to hear me, you listen to me from the distant stars with your sweet smile. You, the wellspring of my endless tears, my home without a tombstone, my obliterated temple, right? So it's a love song, but it's not a love song to a woman. It's a love, as I grow older, more embittered from all the loves, my tears grow more passionate and my heart grows younger for you. But you is the Jewish Vilna, right? My home without a tombstone, my obliterated temple. So I think, there are many ways, of course, you can interpret this life and the crucial choice he made. But I guess it goes back. The sense of obligation towards his mother, his wife, and all his street and his friends was, I just can't let them be wiped off the face of the earth. I just can't let this destruction be final. And I can only do in literature whatever I can to prevent that from happening. So it was I think when I look at his American period, it was a life, of course, of a lot of sorrow and sadness, but a life that of a lot of joy, because he saw the whole world with human foibles and there's a lot of humor in his works too. In other words, he saw the whole human experience, but he saw the whole human experience as it was reflected in his hometown. And in that way, he was able to find joy in life again, not by running away, not like Balberishkin, the shoemaker, who could find some kind of peace by running away most of the time, but by communing with the pre-war life, and especially with the beautiful aspects of pre-war life. Okay, now I'm ready for the last round of questions.
Thank you. All right, numerous questions about his second wife.
I didn't even mention her, but everybody's asking.
Well, first, a whole bunch of people asked if he remarried, and then I started getting a bunch of questions about his second wife, about her translations or other influence on his work.
Okay.
Can you tell us about her?
Okay. I was going to mention her at one point, so I guess I should fill it. His second wife was a Soviet girl from Moscow. In other words, he met her on the way back from Central Asia during the couple months he spent in Moscow before he moved further west to Vilna. She was very cultured, very educated. She was had a degree in literature, and she knew Russian literature. In fact, Roger spoke Russian at home, not Yiddish with his wife, because his wife understood Yiddish, but wasn't really a native Yiddish speaker. That marriage was not a happy one. I saw that. I saw that, and I don't know. I don't want to go into details because it's not. I don't feel comfortable, but I think it's important because it went into his whole dichotomy of the pre-war world and the post-war world. In other words, because there was the first wife, which he always considered, his real basherte, the wife that was just right for him. And then there was the second wife. I mean, because you can also ask, why didn't they get divorced? They had no children. And some of these things I'm sharing are personal conversations. But I think he said, this too is part of my punishment, In other words, no, the life after the Holocaust cannot be the life I had before the Holocaust. And therefore, this is what fate wanted, that my second marriage be an unhappy marriage. She was involved. You saw that somebody, if you look in some of it, some of the translations of his works, she was very, very jealous protective of him. And I don't know if I want to go further. Unless somebody will ask a more specific question, I think I've said enough about the second wife. You realize, of course, those of you who follow the news, she died, she was much younger than him. So she died, what is it, like 5 years ago? He died in 1982. She died in 2015 or so. And she didn't leave a will. She had his whole library and all his papers. Eventually, there was a whole court case, and the city of New York became involved. And now the YIVO Institute in New York has Chaim Grade's papers and library, which is a good place for it to end up. But she didn't make plans for what should happen with his library and papers. Luckily, they ended up not in the garbage, but in an appropriate place.
Thanks for sharing that with us. One wonders if, how much that view of, his life before and his life after, how much that ended up being determining what that marriage was like, right? But don't comment, because I know you have more personal information. Okay, so stepping back from these biographical questions a little bit. So one person asked, who was he writing for? Who did he think would buy his books, or who did he want to buy his books?
Well, when he started writing prose in the 1950s, there were still a lot of Yiddish readers in the United States. It was always declining, but if anything, there had been a bump up in the number of Yiddish readers in the United States, because you did have the DPs and the Holocaust survivors who immigrated from, most of them from Poland. He was very aware that his readership was shrinking, and he was very jealous that Isaac Bashevis Singer was, so quickly and popularly translated into English. Eventually he got translated as well. It's a good question for every novelist. Who is their reader, right? Who are they writing for? I mean, ultimately he's writing from an internal urge to write. And I guess there are many layers of potential readers. In other words, there's the Yiddish reader, there's the translated reader. He knew the Hebrew reader, he knew was following. And but he couldn't get, being a Yiddish writer in America after World War II is a very tough business because your readership is shrinking. Your readership is shrinking, and that your only potential readership is in translation. And there are different ways, I think, and I think time has proven, because there's still interest in him, and there's still things that are going to be reprinted and printed, and a movie was based on one story of his. So I think that enough of what he does is timeless and very deep that he'll be read decades from now still.
So quite related to what you were just saying, there was a question about his writing in Yiddish, and was that a decision for him, or just a foregone conclusion that if he was going to write, it would be in Yiddish?
He didn't really command another language he could write in. He didn't get a higher education other than yeshiva education. There are many such people that because of the war, their lives were disrupted. Even if they survived, they never got the higher education they would have. And so, though he read a lot of world literature, and he read especially Russian literature, he read Spinoza. He's not a provincial person. He loved Spinoza, had a great collection of Spinoza, read Russian literature, but read French literature, art, and because I'm talking from his private library, what was there. But I don't think he ever seriously entertained writing in any other language. And okay, now I'll bring in something autobiographical, because the way I met Chaim Grade really was, I was a graduate student at Harvard in the Jewish Studies program, and through various circumstances, the professor of Jewish Studies, Isidore Twersky, decided to invite Chaim Grade to give lectures at Harvard. This is 1978 or 9. And so Chaim Grade came and lectured at Harvard, in Harvard Yard. And okay, we got to know each other. We were actually not neighbors. My parents lived in the Bronx, not too far from him. But that really made us bond. But what was amazing was the idea of the Yiddish language, a lecture in Yiddish. One of the lectures was on Bialik, actually. A lecture in Yiddish on Bialik being delivered in Harvard Yard. What could be more incongruous than that? But he wasn't willing to speak publicly in any other language.
A lot of people asked about your relationship with him, actually. So, so you told us how you first met him. Are you interested in sharing any more about sort of how it developed from there?
Yeah, I can. First of all, we're polar opposites in many ways. Well, first of all, when I actually met him once before then, briefly, but he wasn't even interested in talking to me before that, because I'm an American boy. How an American young man be interesting to Chaim Grade? Right? You're American. Okay, have your American life. He was much more interested in speaking to other East European Jews than to this young American boy. But then, because of Harvard and because of the lectures, we clicked. What I meant by polar opposites was, here he is the former yeshiva student who's become a totally secular writer. And I, who grew up as a boy, not observant, or not particularly observant. My parents didn't keep kosher when my very first, my child, we started keeping kosher when I was 12. So I grew up, my parents were sort of very much into Yiddish culture. I was a secular Yiddish boy who was becoming religious, and sort of like we're passing each other in the night in opposite directions. So he was intrigued, like, how can someone become religious and be religious in this day and age? And we used to meet pretty often, not only in Harvard, but also in the Bronx, because we were practically neighbors. sometimes in his home, but sometimes because of his wife, he wanted to meet outside the home, nearby, or I don't know if there's, there are things I wrote down, things I learned about his writing from that, and but what's amazing to me is, I'm still reading him. Luckily, he's a writer, which means you can have a very vivid connection with him even 40 years after he's dead, because I can always read his things, and they are truly fantastic novels. So he's a real presence in my life, even though it's been, almost 40 years since he passed away. Okay, I think that's what I have to say about the relationship.
Thanks. It's interesting. I'm just reflecting on what you said earlier, that he saw the mission of his literary career as being to recreate pre-war Vilna through these novels. So you would think that an American boy who was interested in knowing about that world, or I think that's what I was thinking. I mean, it was one of our participants who asked about the audience, but that's what I was thinking about. Who did he want to recreate that world for? Was it for the people from that world, or did he just, or it wasn't even articulated in that way? He just needed it to be memorialized for posterity because of the destruction that happened.
I think he had to be working on multiple levels, for people from that world and people not from that world. No, when he came to Harvard and he met me and a couple of friends of mine who were my classmates, he was very surprised. In other words, here he is, he's been in America more than 30 years, but he hadn't sat down and had conversations with young people, American-born people. That just wasn't his element, his milieu. And he was really pleased and surprised that there's a group of young American-born people who are interested in what he's doing. He just didn't interact with such people most of the time. So he was pleased. He was, but I still think, so I guess it's paradoxical, right? It's on the one hand, he wanted to pass this on to American-born future generations through the translation. On the other hand, there was this barrier, he didn't know, could it really be passed on? Isn't it ineffable that it's that if you weren't there, you can't understand it? So I think there was a bit of both in his attitude.
Thank you. So we just have 1 minute left, but I want to sneak one more question in, because a few people asked about the short story, The Quarrel, that you referred to, and just how kind of how keen his ability was to render such two such different perspectives on on religiosity, and does it still have a place? And we are the Jewish Theological Seminary after all. So I don't know if you want to close with a comment on that.
No, I think that's central to his whole being, right? That he could both see, and he embraced the staunchly secular perspective, but he could totally understand and respect and even love a deeply religious perspective. And the two for him were, irreconcilable, but he felt both. He felt, and this is the story of his life, the irreconcilability, but he's not willing to give up on one or the other. One of it, all right, there's a story, I think it's true, that he often, when he packed his bags to go up to the Adirondacks, he'd pack a pair of tefillin. He didn't put on tefillin, but he packed a bag of tefillin, because he says there's always a possibility that I'm going to repent and become religious again. All right? He did. So I think that ambivalence of, you can't leave it behind, but you can't embrace it. He was very conflicted in that way. But in his works, you see, he thinks there's a lot, obviously there's so much wisdom, so much moral strength and fortitude in this tradition. There is an attitude of love even while he cannot embrace it.
That's such a powerful anecdote, and thank you for closing in that way. This was such a moving and enlightening session, and there was people in, I can tell from the chat, people intimately familiar with his works and people learning about him for the first time, and you've made such an engaging story for all of us. I think pretty much everyone here wants to read more now. So thank you so much for sharing this. What was clearly a very painful journey for him, and yet a very productive one for us that's led to a real legacy. So thank you so much for teaching, as always. And I'm putting into the chat now next week's session, which as it happens is also kind of an intertwined story of the literary and the personal. So I hope that people can join us next week, the 19th, for that. And just once again, thank you so much, Professor Fishman, for teaching us today.
Thank you.